Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session Managing the SharePoint Disruption. My name is Dan Holm, and many of you were in my session earlier today, but I'd like to give those of you who don't know me yet a quick background about who I am, and then we'll talk about this session. My name is Dan Holm. I'm obviously American, so I only speak English. I apologize. I originally hail from Denver, Colorado, but I currently live in Maui, Hawaii. So I arrived yesterday from Maui and am currently experiencing jet lag from a 12-hour time difference. But I understand I sent some of our good weather out here to Antwerp ahead of time. It sounds like you've had some wonderful weather, so it makes me feel at home. I am an MVP in SharePoint Server, and I'm also the Chief SharePoint Evangelist for AvePoint, which is one of the largest software vendors in the SharePoint space. I've spent 17 years as a consultant and trainer and author, consulting mostly Fortune 500 caliber organizations, writing for Microsoft Press. In fact, I wrote the SharePoint 2010 Training Kit, which is the big giant book you'll be able to buy on Amazon later on this summer. And I'm an editor of SharePoint Pro Magazine. And if you haven't yet subscribed to our weekly newsletter on SharePoint Pro Magazine, I encourage you to do that. It's full of great information. And at the bottom of this slide are probably the most important bits of information of the day, which are my Twitter handle, my email address, and a URL from which you can get these slides. The slides will be available on the TechNet Edge site after the event later on this week, so you will be able to get the slides, no problem. But do make sure that you have my email address, because if you have questions about what we talk about today, or any questions really about SharePoint, don't hesitate to ask. My job is to try to help the SharePoint community be successful with SharePoint, and I'm more than happy to answer questions for you. So this particular session is about managing the SharePoint disruption. This is about things you can do as an enterprise to help control and govern the growth of SharePoint in your environment. How many of you currently have SharePoint in place, to some extent or another? Okay, almost everyone. How many of you feel that SharePoint either has already caught fire and is going crazy, or has the potential to catch fire and go crazy in your environment? Yeah, almost everyone. It is an incredible technology platform, and the challenge I see with customers is that once you give users a taste of SharePoint, they want the whole cake. They want everything, and they want it all immediately. And so SharePoint provides some really significant challenges to businesses, and that's what we'll look through today. Now, where I'm coming from, and the perspective I'm bringing into this event, is that information technology professionals and information technology as a whole is burdened with trying to meet the requirements of our businesses, trying to manage a ever-increasing quantity of information, and having to ensure that we are meeting our regulations, maintaining compliance with our security environment, etc. And while we as IT pros are trying to do all of that, our users are getting more technically savvy. Users know if they want to share something that they can post it to Facebook or Twitter or SkyDrive, or take information out of our managed environment into a broader environment. And they're armed with powerful devices as well that allow them to basically bypass anything that we would put in place as an IT organization. They can pull up their Windows phone and start posting information that would otherwise be something we want to control. Finally, we're tasked with doing more with less. I'm sure all of us are in organizations where we're trying to achieve more with less resources at our disposal. So users are trying to get their jobs done. And users will find a way to do it if we don't provide that. So one of the dynamics that we face in an organization is that we need to stay ahead of our users, and we need to create a managed environment that allows them to get their jobs done within our requirements. Do we know what that is? I'm gonna let them troubleshoot that sound for just a second, and I also noticed something wrong with my slide deck, so let me just fix this real quick as well. Old tag in my slide deck. Okay. Sounds like we got rid of that sound. Good. And so users are constantly trying to find ways to get their job done. We need to provide those ways before users find their own way. And there's this technology called SharePoint that we're being tasked with implementing successfully in our organization. So all of these things hopefully... Oh, I think it's me. I think it's the wire on the mic. Sorry. The Freddy Krueger sound. That's better, I think. All right. So that's our life as an IT professional. And then SharePoint, from an industry perspective, has a couple of characteristics that we're going to go into detail in this session. First of all, SharePoint does tend to become the preferred platform for collaboration. That's what Microsoft has designed it to be. Microsoft has priced SharePoint very aggressively. In fact, many of us who have enterprise agreements, SharePoint is more or less free. SharePoint becomes the preferred platform for delivering enterprise solutions like search, enterprise search as an example. SharePoint becomes the preferred platform for developing line of business applications. So SharePoint really becomes critical to the organization, and we'll look at all of the impact that has. In addition, SharePoint changes IT forever, for reasons that we'll look at. And SharePoint becomes a mission-critical content repository. The information that SharePoint actually maintains is something that we have to be concerned about as an organization. And last but not least, SharePoint also becomes a single point of access for content outside of SharePoint. So SharePoint becomes the doorway through which users access what used to be back-end or legacy systems. So these are the broad trends that we see in the community. Each of us as organizations probably are finding ourselves in one or more of these trends right now. And what you're not experiencing, you are very likely to experience down the road. So we'll start by looking at the impact of SharePoint becoming the preferred platform for collaboration, for delivering enterprise solutions, and for developing line of business applications. And one of the key takeaways of this section will be understanding how to define SharePoint in your organization. If you have an organization of any size, you might find that it's difficult to communicate with your managers why SharePoint is important or how SharePoint works. Communicating with your end users about what to expect from SharePoint. Communicating with your developers about what SharePoint is. And so it's the first thing I think you need to tackle in managing SharePoint is creating a common language and a common set of expectations for SharePoint, so that just talking about SharePoint, you can move together as an organization. So SharePoint is positioned by Microsoft as the business collaboration platform for the enterprise and the web. That's the pitch for SharePoint from Microsoft. And each word in this pitch is very heavily loaded. SharePoint is a business collaboration platform. It's not necessarily targeted at consumers, although you probably have seen SharePoint technologies creeping into SkyDrive, where you can use Office web applications. Facebook has Office web applications. So pieces of SharePoint are starting to peek into consumer technologies, but SharePoint really is a business product. It is designed as a collaboration tool, and it is a platform on which you can build additional solutions that can be delivered both in the enterprise, that is intranet, or over the web, extranet and internet. So this is Microsoft's pitch. Each of these things, again, each of these words very, very heavily loaded. How do you dissect this and start communicating with the different audiences in your organization about what SharePoint is? In SharePoint 2007, Microsoft tried to communicate SharePoint with this wheel. How many of us have seen this? Yeah. And this wheel then went through a magical transformation into this. And lots of marketing people made lots of money changing that wheel around. Now, the problem with this wheel is that while it is possible to understand what SharePoint does by looking at the wheel, it is not easy to understand what SharePoint does looking at the wheel. And I've actually seen a number of organizations where people tried to talk about SharePoint in the context of this wheel, and it becomes very difficult for a couple of reasons. First of all, there are what I call functions that SharePoint performs, like social networking, like business intelligence, like search. And those functions are dependent on a set of plumbing, of core capabilities, one of which is the ability for SharePoint to have sites. So users access their team sites, users access a search site, and the site capability, which is called out as its own capability, really does play into all of the other capabilities of SharePoint. In addition, a lot of the other functions don't fall neatly into one of these pieces of pie, so to speak. So I encourage you not to use that wheel as a way of communicating about SharePoint in your organization, but rather to start by looking at the functionality that SharePoint delivers. And SharePoint delivers a lot of functionality, of course. It's a very, very powerful platform. And Microsoft is starting to talk about that functionality in terms of a journey. And this slide illustrates that journey and is something that you'll start seeing more of from Microsoft. So I'd like to present this to you so that you understand what Microsoft is trying to tell you, and also because I think this is an effective way to talk about SharePoint within an organization. So in this case, the functionality that SharePoint provides is split into different buckets, starting on the lower left-hand corner, which is the bucket of content repository. SharePoint is able to manage content in your organization, files, lists, things like that. And that content can be stored by SharePoint or can be accessed from external systems. So SharePoint can tap into external content and present it as well. Now that content then has to be managed. And a set of SharePoint functionality is devoted solely to managing content regardless of what that content is. So for example, and that is what we see at this layer here. So this layer shows us that in order to manage content, we have to be able to set permissions on that content. We have to manage security. That might also involve rights management and records management. We also have to be able to respond to legal concerns through features like e-discovery. We have to be able to find and organize content effectively with taxonomy, and we have to be able to ensure compliance. So all of these features are related to SharePoint content, regardless of what the content is, regardless of what industry you're in, regardless of what business you're in. You will need some or all of these features. Then the next layer relates to features about how users collaborate with the content, how they interact with the content. Now, most interaction comes through the sites capability. So users access team sites, they access other sites, and that's how they get to the content that's stored in the repository. But of course, SharePoint is also integrated very tightly with Microsoft Office, with tools like Exchange and Link. And users can search, can use social tools like My Sites and other capabilities, and third-party collaboration tools to interact with that content. So this middle layer becomes all about how users interact with the content that you're storing in SharePoint. And that's all out-of-box functionality. Then you get to another set of functionality that allows you to assemble custom solutions. So SharePoint allows you to create forms-based solutions, allows you to create workflows, allows you to create dashboards or mashups that put information together in useful ways. Each of these are capabilities that SharePoint has, but you have to configure these to be exactly what you want for your organization. You have to use these to build solutions. And last but not least, SharePoint integrates with line of business systems like PeopleSoft, like Dynamics, like Project Server. So all of these other external systems SharePoint can integrate with as well. And last but not least, you can take all of these capabilities and you can start building out solutions for specific organizations like IT, finance, or HR. You can build solutions for particular industries like healthcare, financial services, or government. So the functionality then allows the platform of capability, the platform of SharePoint allows you to take this functionality forward into specific horizontal and vertical solutions. So rather than presenting everything as a wheel, you can really see that some functionality is related to managing content, some functionality is related to working with the content as a user, some functionality is about building solutions that are specific to your business, and some are horizontal and vertical solutions. So I really find that this message is resonating with my customers as a way of being able to understand what SharePoint is, and then look at it and say, okay, where are we in our journey? As an organization, what are we doing with SharePoint? I have one customer I'm working with right now who is using SharePoint specifically for forms and workflow. They've got other tools that do search. They've got other tools that do social. They've got other tools that do content management, but they don't have anything that allows them to rapidly develop applications. So for them, this is the part of the story that they're diving into. Their users will be accessing these solutions through sites, and then of course there will be content that needs to be managed behind those solutions. So for them, this is their footprint in the journey. And from there, they're then looking at how can we consolidate our other platforms? How can we get rid of our other search tool and use SharePoint instead? How can we get rid of our other portal tools? And that's one customer. An entirely different customer is looking solely at how they move from Windows file servers to a more robust platform. So they're looking at how do we create document libraries in SharePoint and allow users to interact through the web and through Microsoft Office tools with what used to be on file shares. So hopefully you'll be able to look at this blueprint and identify where you are in this journey. And one of the goals you should have is to try to focus what you're doing on as few of these functionalities as possible so that you can get your foot in the door, you can make sure that you've successfully delivered what you're trying to deliver, and then you can start expanding out to additional functionality. So you start in one place, and then, as you'll probably find, users discover that SharePoint can do all these other things, developers discover, and your executives discover that everyone else is using SharePoint for this and this and this, and they want it right away. So use this as a way of mapping your SharePoint journey, identifying where you are and where you can go with SharePoint. I personally like this message a lot, this way of talking about SharePoint a lot more than the wheel. Now this is all just sort of about talking about SharePoint within your organization, talking with users, developers, management. So it's not a technical thing yet, but any questions about this particular message? Okay. One other way of talking about SharePoint that I'd like to just mention briefly is to talk about SharePoint and how it fits into your enterprise technology portfolio. When I sit down with a CIO or a director, a CTO, what they generally tell me is we've got tools that do certain things. Why should we use SharePoint? Where does it fit in? Again, that previous slide can help, but I also like to talk about SharePoint in three categories when I talk to a CTO or a CIO. The first is that SharePoint delivers functionality out of the box. You install SharePoint and immediately you can collaborate, you can do search, you can have browser-based web applications like the Office web apps. So there are things you can do right out of the box that you might not have another tool for in your organization. And you don't have to, again, use every bit of functionality that SharePoint offers. If you've got a tool in place that provides social networking, then don't use SharePoint for that right now. You'll probably find out later there's benefits for using SharePoint later, but you don't have to use all the functionality all at once. The second category of functionality or of discussion with CTOs is portal. Most organizations have some kind of intranet. It might be as simple as an ASP.NET web app. It might be something like WebSphere or a third-party portal tool. And SharePoint can provide functionality that replaces those things. The trick I find is that when people talk about portals, a lot of people will talk about the word portal from different perspectives. A portal to a developer is something they can build on. A portal to a user is their home page. And it's difficult to get everyone to talk about portals the same way. So when I talk about portals, I like to think of portals as really providing a presentation layer, a place where I can go as a user and get to what I need. Now, the things I get to might be functionality from the top set of the slide, but it's just for me, the things that are important to me. Now, that portal can be personalized to me. It can provide navigation, and it might be as big as the enterprise portal or something smaller like a portal for my team or for my department. Or it might even be my site. SharePoint My Sites, which are the user's individual website, if you configure them correctly, should have links to everything the user needs. So that user's My Site could be their home page in Internet Explorer, and from there, they are fed all the information they need to consume as a user and have links to all the places they need to go to access the functionality they need. So when I talk about portal, I think about personalization, presentation of the information, and providing navigation. The third bucket of discussion would be SharePoint as a platform. 6 years ago, when you wanted to develop a web application, you had to think about how do you authenticate users. You have to think about how do you provide search for whatever you're doing in the application? How do you back up your application? How do you manage permissions? All of those plumbing things are now taken care of by SharePoint. And SharePoint provides a platform on which you can build very sophisticated applications. So even if you've got another tool that provides Portal, even if you've got other tools that provide all kinds of functionality, SharePoint may be a great platform for your developers for no-code, low-code, or high-code solutions. And so because it cuts down the amount of development time that's required just to the business logic. You don't have to worry about search, authentication, authorization, and management. Give me 1 second, please. Oops, I'm trying to find my mute button. Recording. Sorry about that. Jet lag and a cold all at once. So all of these points are really about how you discuss and define SharePoint. And the goals of this discussion that I've been leading here and starting is that you need to understand that SharePoint really is different for every organization. What SharePoint is to you is going to be different than what SharePoint is to any other company. And it's also different to different parts of an organization. SharePoint to finance might be very different than SharePoint to IT or SharePoint to sales, which maybe uses SharePoint to support Dynamics. And it's different to different audiences within an organization. A developer will think about SharePoint very differently than an end user, differently than an IT pro, different than a manager. And so it's super important as you try to manage SharePoint that you simply guide the discussion, clarify terminology, and help people understand what SharePoint is doing for you now and what it's going to be doing for you down the road. Any questions at this point on the sort of soft side of SharePoint? Okay. Now the next topic, sort of controlling the SharePoint explosion, is if you are starting with SharePoint in one or two functionalities, how do you ensure that you are successful and that you build a SharePoint environment that will be scalable for you? Even if you are delivering a specific set of solutions for SharePoint, which you should do, you should pick a specific number of things you want to do. We want to deliver search, and we want to migrate from our file servers. Or we want to provide a platform for low-code and no-code solutions. You pick the solutions you want to deploy, but you need to make sure that you're deploying SharePoint as a platform first. So regardless of how narrow your scope is, you can't take shortcuts and deploy SharePoint in ways that will hamper you from expanding SharePoint down the road. And later on, throughout the rest of this session, we'll see some examples of how SharePoint can be deployed as a platform. So you're going to deploy SharePoint as if it is going to become the critical content repository, the platform for collaboration, the platform for developing solutions, even if right now it's only going to be doing a couple of those things. Pick a few solutions that you want to deliver and then present a clear roadmap of what SharePoint will be doing for you down the road. Again, map where you are in the journey, and then look at where you're going to go down the road. Because what SharePoint is doing, and what I see it doing within organizations, is it's really transforming IT. Information technology is very, very different today than it has been in the past, and SharePoint is highlighting and shining a spotlight on those changes. So what I mean by that is SharePoint, first of all, is sitting at the top of a very complex stack of technologies. SharePoint sits on top of Windows Server, providing core operating system functionality, IIS, providing web services, the .NET framework, SharePoint itself, and SharePoint stores content in SQL Server. SharePoint relies on identity from Active Directory or from other providers. So SharePoint is technologically sitting at the top of a very high stack of services. That makes SharePoint difficult to implement, yes. It also makes it difficult to troubleshoot, because if anything is wrong at any point in this stack, it's challenging to troubleshoot. So if something's wrong with SQL, SharePoint will display those or will exhibit problems. And in fact, just as a piece of advice, if your SharePoint environment is running slow, chances are it has something to do with SQL, whether it's the fact that you've got blobs in your SQL database or your SQL databases aren't optimized. SQL is probably the #1 bottleneck in SharePoint. But SharePoint sits on top of this stack of technology, starting with SharePoint Foundation, then SharePoint Server with the standard features, SharePoint Enterprise features, and then anything you develop or acquire that sits on top of those. Because SharePoint is sitting on top of this stack of technologies, the impact on an organization is that now each part of your organization needs to talk in ways that they might not have before. I go into large organizations particularly and find that the SQL team doesn't really ever have a reason to talk with the Active Directory team. And the web services team doesn't necessarily have the need to talk with the Active Directory team. And nobody really talks with the end users on an ongoing basis. And now with SharePoint, because of the complexity and the dependencies in the technology stack, the organization has to improve the communication and the services between various aspects of the organization. So not only is the technology complicated, but the impact on the organization is big as well. For about the last 20 years, we as IT professionals have been really focused on our part of the world. We've been focused on managing information, on taking information that used to be electronic and moving it into, used to be paper and moving it into electronic format. We've been focused on deploying personal computers with operating systems, deploying applications like Office and services like Exchange, and we've been managing devices and information. We've been very technical as IT professionals, as we've had to be. But in a larger organization, again, we might have been focused on Windows, and someone else was focused on SQL, and someone else was focused on IIS. And again, those lines are now blurry. But the other major thing that's happening now is that we get into the 20-teens, is that now we have to focus on getting work done. We're less focused on supporting plumbing, and we need to be more focused on what users are actually trying to do. Because users have access to information from multiple devices, including personal devices. So users are using their own phones, their own computers in some situations. Users are now in user version 2.0, which means they're smart and they know how to use technology, as we mentioned. And users are used to getting satisfaction right away. Users are used to, I need to do something, I can go to an app store and in 15 seconds have that done. And they now turn to us and expect us to get that done as well. So in the 20-teens, I personally propose that information technology is dead. I think if you believe you will be doing information technology in 5 or 10 years, you're wrong. Almost for sure. Because information technology, as it's been, getting information into electronic form, managing devices and operating system and services, all that is going away very quickly, as we see. The cloud is taking over most of it. And if you're going to be in IT in 5 or 8 years, you're going to be working for a cloud service probably. Where you will be in 5 years is not in information technology, but in innovation technology. And I propose this as a new term for IT, is innovation technology. And what I mean by that is that no longer do you focus on the technology, you focus on the solution that your organization requires. Your business needs to get something done. It has a strategic objective, it has tactical objectives, and you need to be listening to those and understanding what those objectives are. Now, what you offer as a technical person is you also understand the technologies. So you know what's out there, or you have the ability to learn what's out there. And of course, things are changing so fast, you have to learn something new every week from a technical perspective. But you've got the ability to master the technology, and you can then align the two, and you can decide what technical solution can be built in order to achieve a business solution. But now your focus is going to be the business solution, not the technology, because the technology will be changing, it will be moving out of our control, into the hands of our users, into the cloud, and we as IT pros need to really be innovation specialists, where we help our organizations innovate through technology rather than just provide a route for information through technology. So I think that that's a very, very, very important piece of the story now, is that we have to manage and master skills that are what we usually hire consultants for listening to our users, defining business requirements, understanding the technology, and aligning the two. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Thoughts? Okay. I personally think one of the most important business skill, or one of the most important skill sets that an IT pro needs to get is project management and the ability to really define requirements and stick to those requirements through the course of a project. Now, the other thing I want to mention about changing IT forever is that as SharePoint sits on top of that stack of technologies, SharePoint exposes flaws in those technologies as well. I've definitely found that SharePoint is the easiest way to find out everything that you've been doing wrong for the last 20 years in IT. If something's wrong with your authentication, you'll find out when you try to implement Kerberos or claims authentication in SharePoint. If something is wrong with the permissions that you've been applying on your file servers, you might not notice them now, but when you turn on indexing, users might start seeing things that you don't want them to see because the permissions weren't set up correctly in the first place. And so SharePoint really shines a spotlight on what we've been doing and forces us into a better set of technical practices as well as into this mindset of delivering business solutions. The third SharePoint trend that I want us to discuss is that SharePoint is really becoming a mission-critical content repository. How do you respond to your organization asking you to put more and more and more information into SharePoint? One important way to respond to this is to use Remote Blob Store. And we talked about this in the previous session, so I'm not going to repeat it here, but I'll summarize it. Remote Blob Store allows you to take the files that are normally stored in SQL in SharePoint and store them in somewhere other than your SQL database. It decreases your storage size and therefore your cost, and most importantly, significantly improves performance in a big, big way. So Remote Blob Store is a really critical technology for responding to the fact that SharePoint will become a content repository, and you're looking potentially at storing terabytes or even petabytes of information in SharePoint. And I actually do know some customers who are storing in the petabytes of information in SharePoint, and it would only be possible with something like Remote Blob Store. A second topic related to the fact that SharePoint will probably become some kind of mission-critical content repository for you is that you're constantly going to be tasked with how you migrate content from some other system into SharePoint, or how you integrate the two. So I'd like to talk about that for a second here as well. If SharePoint is going to become a mission-critical content repository, you need to migrate content, and you need to make sure that whatever management, permissions, access controls, and metadata that was on the legacy system gets brought into SharePoint. There's three main, there's a couple of choices you've got for migrating content into SharePoint. The first of which is heavy lifting or manual migration, where you or a user literally just takes things piece by piece and moves them from a legacy system into SharePoint. And that obviously is very resource intensive, but when you use a manual process for migrating content, you're most likely to be able to align what you're trying to do with that content with your business requirements in SharePoint, whereas the other option for migrating content is to use a third-party migration tool. Now, depending on the system you're coming from, there are third-party tools that will migrate you into SharePoint from just about everything. From Lotus Notes, from eRoom, from Documentum, from file shares. There's tools for just about everything. And these tools are generally very good. They do what they say they will do. They will take content and they will move it into your SharePoint environment, and they will map users and permissions and metadata from the old environment into SharePoint. So they do what they advertise. However, the problem that I encounter as a consultant is that generally the way the content was managed and organized in the legacy system isn't necessarily right for SharePoint anymore anyway. Because SharePoint is a different technology platform. It has features that you didn't have in the legacy system. And if you had those features in the old system, you would have designed your system differently. And also the business has changed from the days that you implemented the legacy system to today with SharePoint. And so even though you can migrate content from point A to point B, the business doesn't need you to be at point B. The business needs you to be at point C. And so I just like to recommend as a consultant that when you look at third-party migration tools, you consider not only whether they technically achieve what you're trying to achieve, but whether they, from a business requirements perspective, get you where you really want to be. And in my experience, the best solution is a combination of third-party tools for some scenarios and manual heavy lifting for other scenarios. So those are two approaches for migrating content. The other option you've got with SharePoint 2010 as far as becoming a content repository is not to migrate the content, but rather to expose the content that stays in the backend system. So SharePoint 2010 gives you some interesting ways of connecting to external systems, including business connectivity services, which is built into SharePoint. And business connectivity services allows you to take data that's in a backend system and expose it in SharePoint as if it is a native list, and to interact with that backend data in many interesting ways. So what the advantage that gives you is users can now come to SharePoint as their single gateway into data, whether that data is in SharePoint itself or whether that data happens to be stored in a backend system. The users see it the same way. The users interact with it the same way. That reduces your training cost, it reduces your support costs, and it may mean that you don't ever have to migrate that content to SharePoint. It can just continue to live in the backend system. Or you can use these connection options as a way of delaying the migration for a period of time. And this is true not only for backend data, like backend databases, but also for file shares. I've had a number of clients, as I'm sure some of you, who have been ready to migrate their file shares into SharePoint because it gives you checkout, it gives you version history, it gives you search, it gives you all kinds of really, really great features. Now the problem is, if you're going to migrate gigabytes, terabytes, or petabytes of data into SharePoint, you then have a storage issue to tackle, and you have an issue of migration and mapping business processes and all kinds of other stuff around that. There are some third-party tools out there, there are at least two, that allow you to connect to a file share, so that in SharePoint you are seeing a document library where the documents don't live in SharePoint at all. They are actually continue to be stored in a file share. Now this is different than remote blob store, where the content goes into SharePoint and then gets moved out to some other location. In this case, this is a connector that exposes the information that continues to live in the file share as if it lives in SharePoint. And these third-party tools then enable you to have all the SharePoint functionality of version history, check-in, check-out, indexing, without ever having to move that content into SharePoint at all. So once again, this allows you to eliminate migration entirely and just continue to live with those files on the file server, or have that be a transition that buys you some time between now and when you want to migrate, and allows you to leverage whatever capabilities are on your backend system. So there are some very, very interesting options for migrating content, which includes not migrating content at all. Any questions on this migration point? All right. And as you do your business requirements in your organization, look at each scenario uniquely. Just because it might be better with file shares to connect to the file server with a third-party tool, there may be other data systems where you want to use business connectivity services, or other systems where you might really want to migrate the content. So there's no one solution that's right for every scenario, even within a single business. The final trend that I'd like to address is the fact that SharePoint becomes the single point of access. And we've hinted at this a couple of times already, that SharePoint becomes the gateway through which users interact with content in SharePoint and on other systems as well. Actually, let me see what I wanted to mention here. Yeah. So as you're considering all of the systems that you're connecting to with SharePoint, these are the types of considerations you need to take into, these are the types of factors you need to take into consideration. You want to look at what systems the content lives in now. So if, for example, you have content on a file share, you might have a certain set of options available to you. You might have content that lives in a third-party system that costs a lot of money and that you want to get rid of. You might have content in a third-party system that is no longer supported. I have a couple of clients moving away from companies' tools that those companies just don't support their tools anymore. So you need to understand the specific characteristics of the system in order to decide what is going to be your best solution. You need to look at the content characteristics. What is the content itself? Is it files? What type of files? Is it data? What type of data? And very, very important, you always want to be focused on information management. How will the information that is stored on that you're dealing with in SharePoint be managed? How is it secured? What are quotas? What kinds of information rights policies and records and retention are applied? You always want to look at those information management requirements. You want to look at the users who are accessing content and the locations they're accessing the content from. Meaning, are users accessing the content just from within your intranet, or are they accessing it over the web, through a VPN, through a gateway of some kind? And what kinds of devices are users using to access content? If users are using iPhones to access content, that's a little bit different than if they're using Windows phones or tablets to access content. You need to look at the connectivity that is in place between the user and the content they're accessing. And you need to look at the usage requirements. How often are they accessing the content? What sorts of patterns are they accessing the content with? All of these factors can be applied to a specific type of information in your organization, whether that information is in SharePoint or on an external system, to decide what the appropriate solution is. Now let's take a look at some of these platform characteristics and start getting to a design for SharePoint. And we'll start with the farm itself. And I'm going to do a little bit of drawing here as well. So in SharePoint, you have a farm, you have your SharePoint server, and you have your SQL server. Now SQL can be running on the same box, but SQL is a performance hog. And generally speaking, you're going to get better performance by dedicating SQL to a separate box, virtual or physical, so that you have enough resources for SQL to do what it needs to do. And we'll talk more about this topology in just a moment. But at a bare minimum, you have a SharePoint server providing websites to users, and that data is being stored on a SQL backend. Now, one of the technical considerations you need to look at with SharePoint and design and architecting a service platform is the latency between the SharePoint server and the SQL server. You need to have very low latency for SharePoint, specifically less than 10 milliseconds. So the SharePoint web front end needs to be able to talk with the SQL backend with a latency of less than 10 milliseconds. Now, in addition, you need to have a good pipe. And I would never do anything with less than a gigabit connectivity between the SharePoint server and the SQL backend as well. But the latency becomes important because for many of us, we need to think about geo-distribution. And what that means is, what happens if our SQL server is in Antwerp, but we have a set of users in Tokyo? So we have users out here in Tokyo doing research and development, and they need to interact with information on SharePoint. Now, on the previous slide, we had all of these different characteristics that we could use to analyze that information. Let's apply those to this scenario. And let's assume that users are going to be uploading AutoCAD documents. So they've got files that they're going to be uploading. These files are quite large, AutoCAD. And we need to figure out how to architect a platform that survives this in a geo-distributed world where our SQL server is going to be in Antwerp and our users in Tokyo. Now, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to put a web front end in Tokyo that has latency of less than 10 milliseconds back to Antwerp. If we can, that's all right, but let's assume we can't. That's pretty unlikely. So we can't really put a web front end in Tokyo. So we have two options. One of which is to have the users access the farm in Antwerp. So the entire farm is sitting in Antwerp. The user is sitting out in Tokyo. They're accessing it through a web browser or through an Office client over HTTP, and they can certainly access the farm in Antwerp. There's nothing saying they can't. The question then is it going to support the usage experience that we want, that our users expect? Will uploading a large document over HTTP, over the WAN, give them the experience they need? Maybe, maybe not. If it's not, we might do something like put a WAN accelerator in place. So we might have a WAN accelerator that improves the performance over HTTP, and that might meet our needs. There are also some workarounds where you could actually put a web front end in Tokyo, but those workarounds are a little sketchy and they're not really supported, so we won't talk anymore about those. So we'll scratch that one out for now. At this point now, we might be meeting a certain set of business requirements. Let me throw a new requirement at you, which is one of the things our organization wants to put on SharePoint are emergency response procedures. So we actually want SharePoint on the intranet to have the instructions for what you do in the case of an emergency. So now our information that is being stored in SharePoint includes documentations for emergency response. If our users are in Tokyo, and as we saw, there is an earthquake or something like that, and the WAN goes down, is our WAN accelerator going to help us? Probably not. So now, what was a perfectly good platform for one specific scenario starts to fail us in another scenario because the type of information that we need now requires us to actually have that information in the site in order to survive a downed WAN link. And this again gets to this challenge of distribution and how do we deal with this. And this is where we start looking at multiple farms. So let me erase this and we'll start again. So we could have a farm in Antwerp, and that farm has a SQL server and web front ends, SharePoint servers. And we could have a separate farm in Tokyo with its own SQL server and its own SharePoint server. And now, over the WAN, we don't necessarily need a WAN accelerator even. We've got users in Tokyo who are able to access that information even if the WAN link goes down. So again, depending on the scenario, our platform needs to look a little bit different. And I'd like to seed this idea with you of having multiple farms for geo-distribution purposes, because most of the organizations I've worked with as a consultant who think they can get by with a single farm for their entire user population around the world end up eventually realizing there are specific scenarios where you just simply need a local farm. It might be because of the type of information you're hosting, like emergency response procedures, or it might be because the performance just isn't good enough over the WAN, so you want to have a farm locally for those Tokyo users to collaborate with each other. Now, with SharePoint, even if you have multiple farms, you've got the ability to create a single enterprise. So these two farms could appear to be a single implementation because the intranet homepage might be on the Antwerp farm, and that might have a link to the team site in the Tokyo farm. So when users open up their homepage, it's actually coming from Antwerp. But when they click the link to their team site, they're redirected to the Tokyo farm so that they're getting better performance as they upload and download documents on their collaboration platform. So you can create the appearance of a unified environment with things like links and navigation. In addition, search unifies the environment. So you could have search running as a service in Antwerp, indexing both farms, so that when a user performs search, they perform it on the enterprise service and get results from both farms. And in addition, search can be published to the Tokyo farm so that when a user performs search using a web part in Tokyo, that query is being responded to by the search service in Antwerp. So geo-distributed farms and providing multiple farms for different sets of users is a real need for a lot of organizations. And the fact that you can publish services across farms and that you can create navigation across farms certainly helps unify that environment. So this is one reason why you might need multiple farms in your environment. We're going to look at several others, but this is one of them. And keep in mind that SharePoint Foundation can come into play here. For example, our Tokyo farm might be a SharePoint Foundation farm. SharePoint Foundation provides pretty good platform for basic collaboration capabilities. It's not quite as rich as SharePoint Server, but it does document libraries and lists, and it integrates with Microsoft Office. It does a lot of what users need at the 80% level, 80-20 rule. So you could have a SharePoint Foundation farm in Tokyo, which reduces your costs of the separate farm. But again, it is a separate farm for that unique location. And even the cloud might be a solution, where if you're working with partners, rather than punching a hole through your firewall, rather than exposing your SharePoint server to the internet, rather than putting Forefront user access gateway in place, you might choose that for a particular set of partner scenarios, you want to have a farm in the cloud with Office 365 for those partner scenarios. So that's another example of a multi-farm scenario. And in those multi-farm scenarios, you run into a couple of problems as an enterprise. The first of which is, how do you get content from one farm to the other? How do you get the emergency response procedures available in each farm in your enterprise? The answer to that, there are a couple of them. First is SharePoint has a feature called content deployment. But content deployment is really meant for one scenario. It's meant for your public-facing website so that inside your firewall you can create the content that you want to post, and when everything's ready, you can put the entire site collection up on your public-facing website. So that's what content deployment is really meant for, and it's scoped at the site collection level, so it's not very granular. The second option is some kind of manual process where users literally copy and paste information from one farm to the other. And in a very limited scenario, that might be okay. And then you have to turn to third-party tools. Content replication is one of the features that Microsoft leaves to its ecosystem of ISVs. And there are several companies out there that have content replication tools that will let you set rules about what goes where. Very, very sophisticated sets of tools. Many of these tools are developed for situations like oil companies, mining companies, and the military, where you might have a ship out at sea that doesn't even have access to a network for long periods of time, that has to have its own farm on that ship, on that oil rig, at that mine. And these tools are designed to support those very, very challenging scenarios. And so guaranteed those tools will be able to address your business scenarios in a normal business. So content replication is certainly one of the challenges you face in a multi-farm environment. Another challenge you face is administration. How do you set a policy that says Dan should have access at this level in all of these different places? Out of the box, SharePoint doesn't give you a way of administering multiple farms. You have to go to each farm separately and set those policies, set that configuration, set those permissions. SharePoint also doesn't give you a way of gathering information from these places. Auditing, for example, is scoped at the site collection level. You have to go to each site collection in each farm, gather those audit reports together, and then crunch them. So what I'm describing here is what third parties will call a single pane of glass, meaning there's one place you can go to set policies and permissions, to drive configuration, and to pull out information for auditing, reporting, compliance, and those kinds of things. And that, again, is a place where Microsoft leaves it up to its ecosystem of third-party vendors. So there's a lot of very, very good reasons for architecting a multi-server farm, but then there are challenges that come with that as well. And as an organization, you need to be very aware of both the reasons why you would use multiple farms and the challenges, so that you can balance out your design so that you're delivering what you need to today effectively, but you're prepared for what you might be asked to deliver tomorrow. Let me make sure I've talked about what I want to here. In addition, on those multi-farm environments, you can use Windows PowerShell to get information and set information in multiple places. So if you're a scripter, PowerShell will do it for you. Otherwise, it's third parties. And another example is branding. Branding across multiple places can be tricky as well. All right. So what we've talked about is the start of architecting an environment that will scale with you, that will be flexible, that will deliver the solutions you need down the road, as well as those solutions you need right now. And before we go on to the next big chunk, which is more of the technical design of SharePoint, any questions at this point? Any thoughts, comments? Okay. Let me check on my time real quick. Good. All right, the final chunk of this section is something that I think is very, very, very valuable for an IT pro, a developer, and a business to understand. And that is how you design SharePoint so that it will be governable for you in the future. And this extends what we were just talking about with farms to some more specific examples. And the key takeaway here for the last 15 minutes is the difference between information architecture and information management, and that these two are not the same. Very, very, very important. Information architecture is about organizing and describing your content. It's about defining metadata and structure and relationships between content. And when you do an information architecture exercise, you generally pull together your knowledge management team. If you're a big organization, you might have librarians, content owners themselves, and subject matter experts. And everyone sits around a table and says, we have this kind of content. We have contracts and proposals and presentations and reports. And you figure out what you have and how to describe it and how to make it easy to find. And what comes out of that kind of exercise includes, most importantly, your site structure. People will create these beautiful diagrams of what their SharePoint implementation should look like. They'll also think about taxonomy and search, making things easier to find. And also targeting content, which means exposing the right content to the right users. That's information architecture. And it is important, but it is very different than information management. And information management is about managing the content itself, which we as IT pros are supposed to be doing. It's about managing access and permissions, about managing the life cycle of content and deciding how content gets created and when it gets destroyed and deleted. It's about managing storage. And for an information management exercise, you pull together your information management policies, your usage policies. You have to look at your regulatory environment. You have to look at the service level agreements, or SLAs, that you've defined with your users. And out of that will come a definition of the permissions, records management policies, compliance, performance, and performance. So information management is a very, very different exercise with a very different set of inputs and a very different set of outputs. Now, the real problem is that most organizations only do information architecture when they're starting down the SharePoint journey. They look at their environment, they describe their content, and they come up with a beautiful diagram of what their intranet should look like. And most of you, if you look at this, you should be able to recognize what's happening. There's an intranet. Underneath that, we want a site for HR, a site for finance. In HR, users can find out about their benefits. In finance, they can submit expense reports. And that is a very good information architecture design. The problem is, if you implement SharePoint this way, it is not going to be manageable for you. The content is not going to be secure. It's not going to be scalable. It's not going to be performant. And so what you have to implement on the back end, what you actually have to put in place with SharePoint, is an information management-driven design, which is shown here, which is very, very, very different, as you can see. So you've got these two very, very different things going on. SharePoint itself is designed for information management, but your users need to see a navigable structure. And what you end up doing is you design SharePoint to manage information, and then you create the navigation structure. So it looks to users like your intranet is designed this way, but in all reality, on the back end, it's managed very, very differently. Now, we're going to step through this process here, but let me show you the results live in SharePoint here. Well, actually, this may take I don't think my SharePoint site is warmed up. We had to change rooms, which I wasn't ready for, so I think I might give this a second here. I apologize for my voice. I'm fighting jet lag and a cold. All right, this is going to take a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spin this up and warm it up, and we'll keep talking and we'll come back to it. So the bottom line of the rest of this session is going to be how you design SharePoint correctly, which is in red at the bottom, and then how you present it to users in blue at the top in a way that works for them. And again, the problem is most organizations only do the information management, or the information architecture, and then they end up finding it doesn't work for them down the road. So in order to build a governable SharePoint implementation, you need to go through a four-step process. And this process is first defining your requirements, then looking at how SharePoint implements management, aligning the two, and finally overlaying the navigation and administration onto that structure. So we'll look at each of these processes, starting with defining your requirements. So this is similar to what we've been talking about so far in this session, which is really understanding what your business is doing. What solutions are you trying to implement? Let's say, for example, you want to implement an intranet and you want to implement team collaboration, and that's what you're trying to deliver. Then you have to look at the types of information you're supporting and how that information is managed. So what are the characteristics of the information and how is it managed? So let's take the intranet, for example. In a typical intranet, so your corporate intranet, pretty much everyone has read access. Let's just assume this is your requirements. Pretty much everyone has read access. A few users are able to add things to the intranet, but it's a very managed, locked down environment. That type of environment is very different than the typical team site. In the typical team site, you have a small group of users, may not be too small, but it's certainly not everybody, a small group of users who have very dynamic access permissions. They can pretty much do what they want within their team site, and the information on that team site shouldn't last forever because that team doesn't necessarily last forever. The information should only last as long as the team does. So you've got two very different types of information, and you need to identify those requirements before you go on to the next step. The next step then is to look at how SharePoint manages information itself, using what are called management controls and scopes. So these are two terms I want to define for you here. A management control and a scope is how you configure SharePoint. So for example, this diagram shows you the logical structure of SharePoint, starting with the farm, which can have one or more web applications, which can have one or more site collections. If you want to assign ownership, if you want to give someone really full control, you do it by making them a site collection administrator, which many of you have already done. And the site collection administrators have full control to all content within the site collection, and they have full access to settings of the site collection. They can turn on and off features, and they have access to the recycle bin. So anything that's been deleted, they actually can restore or even have access to. So if you are a site collection administrator, you have full control, and that is done at the site collection level. You cannot give equivalent access at the sub-site level, at the child site. If you want to have two completely different groups of users with full control of two different environments, you must have two different site collections. Similarly, SharePoint Designer settings can be set at the web application level. So if you want to restrict changes to branding, you can do that at the web application level. So each of the different management controls, turning on and off SSL, can be applied at different parts of this structure. So you look at how SharePoint does what you're trying to do, and then you have to align the two. And this becomes the real design step. And so we're going to go through a couple of examples here to see why you might need more than one web application, why you might need more than one site collection, and we've already started talking about why you might need more than one farm. So let's start with the intranet. Let's assume that in your organization you want to have intranet sites for HR and finance and project management, and project management uses Project Server. So let's say project management uses Project Server, which sits on top of SharePoint now, by the way. And let's assume that you have a very busy project management organization. They do a lot of work. It's very intensive. And you're finding that project management is slowing down your entire intranet. That response to the HR intranet, response to the finance intranet is slowing down because of what project management is doing. That's because project management probably shouldn't have been under the same web application. Instead, we can put whoops, somehow there's a slide that's hidden here. Let me find out what's going on. Oops. PowerPoint just jumped way out of where I wanted it to be. And while I'm taking this quick pause, let me also start up another web app. Okay. So instead, if we have project management in a separate web application, one of the things you can do with your web applications is you can distribute the load of a web application to a different set of servers. So by setting up project management as its own web application, we have the ability to point user requests for project management to a different set of servers than to the intranet itself. So one of the things that is scoped at the web application level is the servers that actually respond to user requests, because DNS and load balancers can be pointing requests to different servers. In addition, at the web application level, we have the ability to restrict SharePoint Designer changes. So let's just say that your requirements are that your intranet is completely locked down. No one can use SharePoint Designer to do anything. That's a fairly typical set of requirements. And we can do that at the web application level. That is the scope where that management control is applied. But on your team site, SharePoint Designer can be exceptionally valuable. You can use it to create mashups and data views. You can use it to format pages more effectively. You can use it to create workflows. So on your team sites, you probably will want SharePoint Designer in place. Therefore, the only way to really allow teams to use SharePoint Designer will be to have a separate web application for your collaboration sites. So now we've split off our intranet, which is sort of read-only content about the organization, from our teams, where the teams collaborate with each other. And by having it in a separate web app, that gives us a separate scope with which to manage the environment. Does that make sense? Okay. I'll skip that example here. Now, these are some of the things that are scoped at the web application level. So you can use this slide as a reference. These are some of the things that you need separate web apps to scope successfully. The two we've talked about are the servers hosting the web application and SharePoint Designer controls. So at this point now, we have 3 web applications for several different reasons. Let's actually move forward through this to yet another example of a client collaboration. If we're going to have a site that allows us to collaborate with our clients, let's call it http://clients, we might want our clients to access the site using SSL. If we want our internal users to use plain old HTTP, and we want our external users to use SSL, the way we accomplish that is by creating what's called a zone. And a zone is another component of SharePoint that allows you to have another gateway into the same content with a different URL. So we can take that web application, extend it to another zone. External users can come in over HTTPS, internal users can come in over port 80, and all the users get access to the same content. So SSL is actually scoped at the zone level. You can also set policies and other things at the zone level. So this slide will be a reference for you about what you can scope at the zone level. So now the number of web applications we have starts extending out quite a bit. And I'd like to give you one last example here of web applications, and I think the environment is almost ready to show you this. Let me spin up one more. And the last one that I like to encourage organizations to have a web application for is, actually let me just type it here, is a web application for applications. And this web application is designed to host solutions that you build that meet a specific need. So for example, if we're going to have an expense report application in our organization, we would put it under HTTP apps. Now the reason is, one of the other things that is scoped to web applications is upgrades. Down the road, when you upgrade to the next version of SharePoint, there might be features in the next version of SharePoint that you want to use to improve collaboration on your Teams app. And you might be very concerned about upgrading that application to SharePoint version 15. The current version is version 14. But there may be things that you've done in your application development that would be blockers to upgrade. So there may be something you built in your expense report application that would prevent upgrade. By having custom applications in a separate web app, that allows you to upgrade your more standard web applications much faster, leaving the old applications behind on your 2007 farm. So this would stay on your 2010 farm. And in fact, this makes a lot of sense, because if you've built an expense report application, it does the job it needs to do. It doesn't matter whether it's on 2010 or version 15. It does the job based on your business requirements. It doesn't have to be upgraded at all. And so having an application for applications is another thing I really encourage organizations to do. So let's take a look at our example now live. So on this farm, we've actually implemented exactly what we've been drawing, and let's see what the user experiences with it. So here we have our intranet. This is the published information. So a user can come in and see information about the company. They can drop in and see information that the finance department shows. And then on the finance department site, there's a link to the team site. Now, before I go to that, notice the intranet is at http://intranet. When I click the finance team site, it takes me to the finance team site, assuming I have permissions, of course. If I didn't have permissions, I couldn't get in. This team site is in a completely different web application, http://teams. Similarly, if I go to the expense reports from the intranet, I'm actually in a completely different web application, http://apps. So the information architecture, the drawing that we created about how we want our intranet to look, can still be achieved. But behind the scenes, we've created a set of scopes that allow us to manage information successfully. That takes us to our fourth step, which is overlaying the administration and navigation onto this potentially complex environment. So let me skip to that slide here. I have some extra slides that I use in some events. And this one, I forgot to hide them. Yep, sorry about that. So this takes us to our fourth step, which is the fact that we now have, again, this divided environment where the more farms we have, the more web applications we have, the more site collections we have, the more content databases we have, the harder it is to provide navigation, content management, and administration. And in the case of navigation, you've got several choices for how to approach it. You can manually add links that get users from point A to point B. And that's what I've actually done in the environment we were just looking in. I added the links that created the site structure that our information architecture team wanted, but behind the scenes was being managed effectively. There's also third-party tools that support navigation, and you can turn to some of those as well. Secondly, you need to think about content management and also administration. Again, that idea of a single pane of glass, where if we have multiple web applications, we might need to drive policies into those web applications, configuration, we might need to pull out settings and reports for auditing and compliance, and all of those things do become tougher and can again be answered by Windows PowerShell or third-party utilities. So the real key is to go through these four steps of understanding your requirements, knowing how SharePoint can support those requirements, and then aligning the two. And you will end up with multiple farms. You will end up with multiple web applications. You will end up with multiple site collections. And then your environment will be manageable. Unfortunately, it won't be very easy or navigable, so you then have to, as the fourth step, add the navigation and administration. Now, there's a ton more that we could say about this, but unfortunately, we only have an hour and 15 minutes to talk. So if you've got additional questions, feel free to come up and ask. I'll be happy to answer them for you. And also, if you go to sharepointpromag.com, I've written a couple of articles about this concept of designing a governable implementation, which is, again, the four steps that we've been going through here. So with that, I'd like to thank you guys for coming. Please do fill in the feedback and surveys you receive. The slides will be up on the TechNet Edge site later on this week, and I will also post them on my SkyDrive for you as well. Thank you guys very much for coming. I look forward to seeing you later on in the event, and if you're heading home after this session, travel safely. Take care.